Welcome to CWJah Talk number 26. This show is going to be part 8 in our ongoing series about the pre-Christian evidence that many Christians, including Christian witnesses of Jah like me, believe credibly supports the belief that before Jesus was born, there was evidence, information that the Jews believed in and preserved as part of the biblical texts that ultimately we find fulfilled in Jesus. So I think you'll see that if true, it's not just the kind of application that you can easily put together. The things written beforehand about things someone else would do appear uniquely fulfilled in the histories that we have of Jesus' life and teachings. So, as Christian witnesses of Jah, we base our beliefs on the best available evidence, whether that's God and the existence of intelligent eternal life, which is scientifically demonstrable, or whether it's a part of our history, things that people believe, whether they're Christian or not, actually happened, or that happened and are associated with people that are real or were real, that really lived, existed, and did the things that our written histories, biblical and many non-biblical, say happened. Okay, so we've done a number of shows that I think have established credibility in the biblical text in terms of its historicity, its lineage and ancient transmission through long periods of time while maintaining a credible text with differences really that are definable often mostly in relation to controversial beliefs, like whether Jesus is the Messiah. So in many cases, we have texts that Christians will use in biblical texts that are believed to have been written before Jesus was born that point to him as the Messiah. But some of these texts that are preserved in some manuscript traditions that do appear to have a fulfillment in Jesus, or that could be seen as having a fulfillment in Jesus, the things he did and is said to have taught. Others who don't believe in Jesus either have a different understanding of the text, if it's an agreement on what the text says, like Psalm 110:1. For the most part, there's agreement, as we considered in one of our prior shows, on what the text says. But the disagreement comes into play on what it means. What does it mean when David says, Jehovah said to my Lord? Okay, so in the text we have today, Psalm 40, verse 6, we're going to read verses 6 through 9, but really verse 6 is where you have a significant difference in both the reading and I guess you would have to say understanding of the text. But I believe that regardless of the reading, that the understanding is very similar and that they both, if different, can be shown to have unique fulfillment in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. So let's talk about that text and what is the basis for our understanding of Psalm 40. What does Psalm 40 actually say? Well, let's take a look. Let's go ahead and read the text we'll read it according to the New World Translation, because it's a text that I'm familiar with, that I think often does present critical information that can be used. And even if controversial, we can use it as a basis for discussion. I'm working on my own translation based on what I've been able to do to date, but I've not completed a translation of the Psalms, and so I defer to those who have in ways that we can still use. So in the Hebrew text tradition, based on the Masoretic Text, which is a complete Hebrew Bible from the 10th century CE, but that is very close to the text that we find in the 1,000 or more year earlier Dead Sea Scroll texts. There's some differences, just like the ones I've been talking about that often relate to controversial texts, but we don't have Psalm 40 verse 6 in the controversial part that I'm referring to, and that we'll read in a moment, represented in the Dead Sea Scroll texts. So our earliest texts of Psalm 40 and the Hebrew sense is really the Masoretic tradition. And I would argue also, you could say that Jerome of the 4th century represents an understanding of the Hebrew text that is consistent with the Masoretic text. But we'll get to that. It's a little more complicated. And so we'll sort it out. Now, as far as Psalm 40, verse 6 is concerned, in the Greek texts, we do have early representation in, for example, several Septuagint texts. Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, the last being from the 5th century, the first two from the 4th century. And then we also have another manuscript of the Septuagint dated to the 2nd and 3rd century that is also consistent with the reading found in those Greek texts. So we have support for the Greek text reading, which is also consistent with the Greek reading of the New Testament text of Hebrews 10:5. It's a text that quotes from Psalm 40, verse 6, or in the Greek text, it's often listed as Psalm 39, 6, 7. So just know there's a little difference there. But we're referring to the same substantive text. Okay, it's not a different text. It's just a differently numbered in different editions. So we'll get back to that in a moment. But if you're reading in the Greek Septuagint text or a Greek translation into English of the Septuagint or another language, it might be in Psalm 39 instead of Psalm 40. Okay, so we have support for the Greek reading that's shown in these Septuagint texts all the way to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. Our best, really, Greek translation texts. Not our best, we have other fragments and certain other texts, but complete texts, those three, and then the other document I referred to, one of the Bodmer papyri for the Septuagint that we'll review in a moment. With those three Septuagint text readings, those represent our best early Greek reading, apart from the quotation in the New Testament, which we have represented in papyri or P46. So that's another early and very good text of the New Testament, or parts of the New Testament. So we again have support from the 2nd century through the 5th century for both the Old Testament translation of Psalm 46 into Greek, and listed often as Psalm 39, 6, 7, and also in the New Testament quotation of that same psalm in Greek from a translation that is believed to have existed during the 1st century, when that letter was written to the Hebrews. And as we'll discuss, that letter to the Hebrews would either have been presenting a reading known to be different from the Jews of the 1st century in either Hebrew or Greek, or one that was consistent with what they were reading and then was changed later. So the earliest reading that we have for what is essentially a reading different from what Hebrews 10:5 says, we're going to get to it in a moment, I don't want to just quote parts of it, is from the 4th century in Jerome. And so we could argue for at least another 100 years, 3rd, maybe even 2nd century, to the Jewish texts that were translated into Greek by people like Aquila, Symmachus, Theodotion. There were famous Jewish translators of the Hebrew texts, Hebrew Aramaic texts, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And so these would have been contemporaries with people like Origen and others, and their writings would have been considered authoritative, probably in large part, and somewhat equivalent to the Septuagint text by people like Jerome. Maybe not equivalent, because Jerome might have been more in the Christian mindset of accepting the Septuagint as really, inspired writing, and quoted, therefore, by people in the New Testament because it was considered a reliable translation, at least when it was quoted. But Christians often viewed the Septuagint as more inspired, you could say, more authoritative than their own documents at the time they were being written. Of course, they were later then viewed as more inspired, having been written by the apostles and followers of Jesus through the Holy Spirit. So that gets off onto a different subject. But I'm trying to give you a sense of the context of time and text when these things happened. These different views were expressed and available to these different people. All right, so let's read the text with that introduction to the material. Let's read the subject text in English, And then let's discuss these two differences. Why does Jerome represent the reading that's consistent with the Masoretic tradition of the 10th century, showing that that view was at least existing in his day in the 4th century? Why is there a difference in what he and Masoretic Text tradition are representing and what Hebrews 10:5 is representing? What does Hebrews 10:5 say? Well, here's Psalm 40 as it is translated into the English of the New World Translation from the Hebrew text. Let's read it together. Psalm 40, verse 5. And remember, we're going to read 5 and, well, we'll read 6. We'll try to stay there, right here. Top of the text. This is the New World Translation into English of the Masoretic Text of the 10th century. And here it says, "Sacrifice and offering you did not delight in. These ears of mine you opened up. Burnt offering and sin offering you did not ask for." Now let's take a look at the rest of the other two texts, because this is also part of our basic reading and consideration today in terms of the Messianic application. It goes on to say, "In view of that, I said," this is in Christians' view, the Messiah speaking, but King David, who's writing and directly saying it, but in a prophetic sense applicable to the Messiah. "In view of that, I said, here I have come. In the roll of the book, it being written about me. To do your will, O my God, I have delighted, and your law is within my inward parts. I have told the good news of righteousness in the big congregation. Look, my lips do not restrain. O Jehovah, you yourself know that well." Okay, so this is what I'm going to present today as a Messianic application. There are other parts you could argue for as well, but I'm going to try to keep it simple and concise. Verses 6 through 9. Now you notice here, verse 6 says, "These ears of mine you opened up." Okay, so now let's take a look at another text where this verse is quoted in the New Testament. Turn to Hebrews 10:5. We just read in Psalm 40, verse 6, that the Messiah, or David is speaking about the Messiah prophetically in the sense of Jehovah opening up his ears. And if you notice, we'll go back to that real quickly. You notice right here, it goes on to say right after that, so "these ears of mine you've opened up." And then the next verse, "Here I have come in the roll of the book, it being written about me to do your will. Your law is in my inward parts. I have told the good news. My lips I do not restrain." So his ears being opened up leads to him receiving these directions, responding to Jehovah, doing his will, delighting in it, like we read about wisdom in one of our prior shows. Having his law in his inward parts, Jehovah's laws, his lips not being restrained from what? Speaking about Jehovah. So, and we could even go down further. We're not going to directly consider verse 10, but we'll indirectly just read it right now. We'll probably won't come back to it, but he goes on to say, "Your faithfulness, your salvation I have declared." So these things he is not covered up. Okay, he is openly speaking these things as part of his role as the servant of Jehovah. Now this part here, though, "these ears of mine you've opened up." Okay, so this is how the Masoretic text presents it, and one way that Jerome also presents it, as you'll see. But it's consistent with what it goes on to describe the person is doing. Right? So if your ears are opened up, and then as a result of that, you come forward in response to what someone wants you to do, and then you do it, there's nothing wrong with that in terms of the account and the narrative. It makes sense. And you're going to see it fits in a unique sense with the things that Jesus did. But before we take a look at those texts, Let's go to Hebrews 10:5. Okay, so Psalm 40, verse 6. These ears of mine you've opened up. Sacrifice offering and sin offering you did not want. Now in Hebrews, this is written, in our view, in the 1st century. Many believe before the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD. Historical event that everyone can verify. In Hebrews 10:5, the text we just read in Psalm 40, verse 6, reads like this. Okay. So we'll read right here. We'll read the rest of it because you'll see that it's basically quoting exactly what we just read. Here, the author of Hebrews is presenting a series of quotations. He quotes from the Psalms quite a bit, actually, indicating clearly that in the 1st century, they had a text of the Psalms that they were able to use and quote from, just like here. And we have early representation of Hebrews in P46. So 2nd, 3rd century text representation of the quotation of Psalm 40, verse 6. What does it say? Hence, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you did not want, but you prepared a body for me. You did not approve of whole burnt offerings and sin offerings. Then I said, look, I am come, in the roll of the book it is written about me, to do your will, O God. Okay, so clearly quoting from Psalm 40, right? But this part here is different. In the Hebrew text, it says ears, but here in the quotation of Psalm 40 or 39, if it's quoting from the Greek, which is probably the case, it's likely the case that because of the extent to which, unless this was originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew, but the text as we have it in P46 or Hebrews as a whole indicates that it is quoting from an existing version of the Psalms in Greek that then has this reading similar to one of the Bodmer papyri of the 2nd, 3rd century and the three, most prominent codices of the Septuagint, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus. Body. The word is soma. Just like you can see on the thumbnail that I put for the show in the red box. That's actually a snippet of Codex Alexandrinus, which I'll show you here. You can review online as well. That's actually Codex Sinaiticus, but here I'll put the links below. You can go to this digital library and review the online edition of Codex Vaticanus. It's great. Digitized. You can flip through it and look at these different texts. Of course, you have to be able to read Greek to effectively use it, but you can at least verify different readings and see different things. This one's in more cursive. So you want the one in the uncial. Sometimes there's two different Codex Vaticanus. This one may not be the exact one I wanted to show you. It will be written in full uncial script, and then there's another text that some people confuse as Codex Vaticanus, the uncial one, but that's in minuscule script like this one. But in any case, I'll put the correct links below. Here's Codex Sinaiticus, where you can see it online. This one's really good. You can go to the verse right here, and then click over on the side, and then it will highlight, as you can see, the different words that you click over here. And then you'll be able to find the word much easier, like you see here. This is the uncial script. And then you can do better research that way. So, all right, so now let's move from there. And we'll go over to, back to the text in Hebrews. So the Masoretic tradition, in the text translated by the New World Translation and others that we read, Psalm 40, verse 6, it uses the word for ears. The Septuagint text that we have, the Bodmer, Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, all use soma. Okay, just like in Hebrews 10:5, P46. So let me share with you an article that might help clarify some of the differences here. So we're dealing really with, number one, what text is reliable and should we use for Psalm 40, verse 6, or 39, 6, 7 in the Greek in terms of what was existing in the first century. According to the author of Hebrews, P46, the text that was existing and used at that time, the Greek of Psalms, read soma. But we have other translations done in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Hebrew text, Hebrew-Aramaic text, that use the word otia, ears, consistent with the Masoretic text. So which is it? Who's right? Is the author of Hebrews correct? Are the Jewish translators of the 2nd and 3rd century correct? Is Jerome correct? Well, let's take a look. Let me share with you an article that I wrote that I think captions some of this information well. And then I'm going to put back online after we're done today. I had to take it down because right after I put it up, a little time after, someone alerted me to a mistake I made. It's clearly something that conflicts with what I argued the whole article. I'll show you the exact mistake. Once I realized I had done it, and I was going through so much at the time, I just took it down, and I'm just now getting back to it because so much has happened. So either way, this is the article that I wrote back in 2012. I was doing a series at the time called Upon the Lampstand, where, I would post questions I would get, like I still do, and then I would just answer them. And then I'd have a library or a catalog of Q&As that people could sort through. They're still there. If you go to my Elihu site and you go to the Upon the Lampstand, this one's not on there. I had to take it down, but it will be back up later today, okay? And I'll put a link in the description below. But basically, back in 2012, I dealt with this same issue, answering the question, why does the Greek text of the New Testament book of Hebrews 10:5 use body in its quotation of Psalm 39:7 Greek or 46 Hebrew, when the Hebrew Masoretic text of the quoted psalm uses ears, not body? Okay, so the reason is, as I explained, that obviously the author of Hebrews is using a Greek text that says soma, body. It doesn't strike me that the author of Hebrews is translating Psalm 46 into Greek as he's writing. Maybe. And the term that is used in Psalm 46, ka'ara, or kara, is similar to ka'ari, the text and the terms that we discussed, or the term depending on how you view it, in Psalm 22:16. So I'll put a link, or there is a link actually to that video below. But this term is very similar in sounding and in application, I believe, to what we're dealing with here. So in Hebrews 10:5, it appears the author's quoting the Greek, a text that reads soma. I don't believe that he's translating the term used in the Hebrew text. For example, if he read aznaim, which is the Hebrew text for word for ears in the Masoretic text, if the author of Hebrews saw that term and used body, it's still possible, because as we showed, really the preparation of the ears led to the activity by the body in a way that involved the proclamation and declaration of the things involving Yahweh. So it really was more the ears representing the preparation of the body for that activity. And so it's possible that the author of Hebrews saw in aznaim this sense of soma, or body, as being the thing prepared in order to fulfill Jah's will. With that in mind, let's take a look at a couple texts from the book of John, where Jesus says several things that I think you'll find equally interesting to what we've considered already. Okay, so let's go with the reading, prepared my ears, or cleaned out my ears, dug out my ears. The Septuagint basically says prepare. You could read the Hebrew text is cleaned out, dug out. But as I said, with regard to the use of that term for the Messiah, and, digging out or preparing the hands, like with a starter hole, preparing them basically for crucifixion. I think you have the same thing here, if that's the sense that we're going to accept. because I think we can accept either one. And that may be what the author of Hebrews thought and just used body, because that was more consistent with the overall teaching and thought that the Word became flesh and that the things that were prepared as part of the body that he inhabited were being done all along, all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and of course Jah's ultimate or original proclamation of the seed in Genesis 3. We'll get to that in a moment. And I think that's really the point of the author of Hebrews. And he ultimately gets to the conclusion that the whole body was offered in sacrifice to Jehovah, the same body that was prepared. So if we go with ears, I still don't see a contradiction. And I think it's actually even consistent with preparing the body for the activity described in the reading, in the context of the reading, prepare my ears. These ears of mine you've opened up. Okay, so let's see how that would fit with Jesus. Let's go with the reading ears for a moment. Let's see how that would fit with Jesus. We're going to go to a few texts in John right here. And we'll go to John 7. Just take a look at a couple texts. You tell me if the idea of Jesus' ears and him hearing is significant. And we're going to read from one book about his life and teachings. And we're going to read 3 texts over the course of 5 chapters. So just within 5 chapters, there are 3 sections that explicitly tie the importance of Jesus' hearing to his messianic role. John 7:15 through 17. We'll read right here. Therefore the Jews fell to wondering, saying, how does this man have a knowledge of letters when he has not studied at the schools? Verse 16, Jesus in turn answered them and said, what I teach is not mine, but belongs to him that sent me. Verse 17, if anyone desires to do his will, he will know concerning the teaching, whether it is from God or I speak of my own originality. So he wouldn't be speaking to us if it wasn't something he heard from God. He gets more explicit about that in John 8, right here. Let's take a look at John 8, 26 through 28. I have many things to speak concerning you and to pass judgment upon. He's talking about those who are opposing him, the Jews at this moment. Not all of them, but these ones. As a matter of fact, he that sent me is true, and the very things I heard from him I am speaking in the world. Verse 27, they did not grasp that he was talking to them about the Father. Verse 28, therefore Jesus said, when once you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, or the Messiah. The exact same expression used by John a few verses later for the once blind man. Ego me with the implied predicate. We've gone over this before, whole video about it. I highly recommend it. Therefore Jesus said, when once you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, the Messiah, and that I do nothing of my own initiative, but just as the Father taught me, I speak these things. Taught, heard, prepared my ears. Let's go to another text, John 12. This idea of Jesus as the one who heard, had his ears made ready so that it effectively made his whole body prepared for the role in which he was to come in the book that it was written about him so that he would do these things. John 12. This was not a hidden teaching. This was right there. This is often why Trinitarians and non-Trinitarians clash, because we believe these things are clear and they look at them a little differently. We believe a lot differently. Either way, I think we agree on these things, that he came and spoke what the Father taught him. We just disagree on the significance of what that means. John 12, 48. We're arguing now for and with the reading in the Masoretic Text, as translated in versions like the NWT and others that follow it, that reads, prepared or open my ears, which is different from the reading in Hebrews 10:5 in the New Testament letter represented in P46 that uses soma, not otia in Greek. Otia meaning ears, soma meaning body. Okay, so let's go with the reading that isn't consistent with Hebrews 10:5 for a moment. Because I'm going to show that even if body isn't the reading, and that's just how the author of Hebrews, understood it as he translated it, or based on the text he had available to him, we can use either one. I've already showed John 7 and John 8 how they're consistent with having heard and being taught and the effect that has, which is exactly like what we see described in Psalm 47, 8, and 9. The effect that it had on the opening up of the ears of the one being spoken about. John 12, 48 through 50. He that disregards me and does not receive my sayings, this is Jesus, has one to judge him. The word that I have spoken is what will judge him in the last day, because I have not spoken out of my own impulse. The Father himself who sent me has given me a commandment as to what to tell and what to speak. Verse 50, also, I know that his commandment means everlasting life. Therefore, the things I speak, just as the Father has told me, so I speak them. Father gave him a commandment. The Father told him what to speak. So, these texts are absolutely consistent with Aznaim, ears in the Hebrew Masoretic Text tradition, or otia, if we see that as part of the Greek Septuagint tradition existing prior to or during the time of the first century, even in contrast to Hebrews 10:5, which we'll get to. I don't see a problem. I think we can readily, if we're dealing with some of our Jewish friends who want to have a good discussion, disagree with us, think the reading of Psalm 46 is ears, not body, and think that that's the real issue, why even bother? Right? Because the evidence we have is split in a way that, even though I think it comes out favorable to the reading body, we're going to get to it in a moment, I don't think it's necessary. I think you could just say, well, here's what I found on the reading issue. But let's talk about your reading. Ears. Prepared the Messiah's ears. Do you view this as Messianic? It's not clear what the tradition is, Jewish, in terms of the rabbis, as far as the existence of, for example, a Targum of the Psalms that they would comment on and have viewed messianically. But that's later anyway. The fact is, we have the author of Hebrews using it and quoting it repeatedly in his New Testament letter. So it's pretty good reason to believe that it actually existed, and he wasn't just writing things that people would think, what are you talking about? Well, where's that from? So that would not have established any credibility, which is what they wanted. They were a growing group of people that others viewed suspiciously, likely in various ways because of Jesus being crucified. But if you had credible references and teachings, well, then those things would make headway. So I do believe that the reading in the Masoretic Text and that Jews use today of Psalm 46 can be accepted. I don't think it's so far out of the tradition that we can't accept the writing of Hebrews 10:5 as an independent and accurate because of the sense in which body would include the preparation of the ears, but it's the body that then does the things that the preparation of the ears is for, right? So I don't see an inconsistency in that sense. I think that, in fact, it makes sense, and so we should use it in the way that we can apply it to Jesus' life and teachings, like I just did. You could share those three texts and say, you know what, that reading has credibility, and so often we view our New Testament writing of Hebrews 10:5 as accurate in the sense that it represents what is essentially at issue there, right? Getting ready to declare the message and to come and fulfill the role about which it was written for the Messiah. So we don't really see a contradiction with ears. We just see the New Testament writer of Hebrews' use of body is either representative of an existing Psalms Greek tradition in reading, or an understanding of the existing reading or the Hebrew Aramaic text reading that is still consistent with the overall meaning of the psalm in context. See, 7 through 9 go on to describe effectively what takes place as a result of having your ears prepared. And so I think you can very easily skip past the difficult part of the reading. It's important. We're going to get to it in a moment, in fact. But if you really want to effectively try to show how these texts, regardless of the reading, they still make sense. They're not so different that you all of a sudden you can't use Psalm 40, verse 6, or 39, 6, 7 as proof that the Messiah would have his ears prepared in order to do Jah's will. That's exactly what Jesus did. That's exactly what it says happened to him. So, and I just read 3 texts from within a span of 5 chapters of one book. There are many different references consistent with John 7, John 8, and John 12. And that would therefore be consistent with the use of Psalm 46, 39, 6, 7 that has the reading ears. Okay? So make sure you understand that well so that you can, if appropriate, move right past the reading issue, accept their reading. Right? It makes perfect sense and might even make them more convinced that Jesus is in fact the Messiah, because most Jews, they're used to hearing the Trinitarians and others who don't really highlight these texts, I don't think, the way non-Trinitarians do because of how we understand them relative to the Father. And so when Jewish non-believers read the application of Psalm 40, verse 6 in the Masoretic Text to the New Testament text that we read, like John 7, 8, 12, versus Hebrews 10, 5, well, they might be more persuaded by that. Okay. And then you could show them that there was also this understanding consistent with the term body, which we don't see as too different from ears, and then you could talk about what we discussed. Let's go back to an article that I wrote, though, because I want to share more information that I think will benefit you in a way that then you can make more use of in terms of the text discussion, right? We still want to know which reading is more reliable. I ultimately don't think that's the most important thing because we can use either one, and they're not as different as the readings might at first suggest. Okay, let's take a look at the text. All right, so I've got a few. So we're back in the article I wrote in 2012. And I started to, share part of the article and highlight Hebrews 10:5 as the reason why the New Testament reads the way it does versus the way the Psalm does in the Masoretic Text. So here's the evidence. Let's get right to it. This is the support. This right here, this section, is basically the best support for the reading ears. Middle 2nd century, we have Origen's Hexapla, which is a multi-column presentation of the Hebrew, or the different Old Testament texts, different versions of it. You have the Greek translation by Aquila, the Greek translation by Symmachus, Greek translation by Theodotion, and then you have what are known as Quinta and Sexta. And I have a note down here. These aren't terms that most people are familiar with, so yet if you just consider a couple things, it's not like we reference or read Origen's Hexapla a lot, right? But if you just break it down simply, you can understand it. You take a look at the note. Though meaning 5th and 6th, let me line this up, respectively, Quinta and Sexta here refer to what are believed to be the 7th and 8th versions of what was originally a 6-fold column hexapla. So you see, it can get a little confusing, but you just got to know these details and then apply them later on. Quinta and Sexta are 2 additional Greek translations of the Old Testament, which were added later. That is after the first 6 versions of Origen's work were completed. So this is the information we have. We have these readings from Origen's Hexapla, which, while we don't have the actual text of the Hexapla in all respects, we have fragments. It's dated to the time when Origen lived, which is mid-2nd century, and it represents those translation readings, the ones I've highlighted right there. Then you have the reference here, which involves Jerome. I mentioned him earlier. Late 4th century. And this is from a Latin Psalter, which is a collection of psalms basically for devotional use. And so, but this version This Psalterium Gallicanum is a re-revision of an earlier Latin Psalter, or an earlier Latin collection of these Psalms. So, then if you go to the next reading, the 9th and 10th century, you go to these Greek texts. The 9th and 10th century text, Codis Sanguinensis, is it's an 9th to 10th century transcription of a 6th century Greek text of these Psalms. So I'm sharing that with you so you understand the relationship between the different texts referenced. One is a 300 to 400 year later transcription of an earlier psalm. I think still credible in terms of representation of the 6th century, but should be taken with a little bit of grain of salt, right? The Psalter with a grain of salt. And so then you have the 10th century Masoretic Text. And that's really, in terms of the credible texts, it's probably our best one. Although these are certainly significant, especially the Jerome reference and the Hexapla, of course. But Jerome, being a Christian, in accepting the reading ears, we'll get to it in just a moment. But I think that provides a lot of credibility to that reading. And so I note here that the Hebrew text of Psalm 40 is not preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like we talked about. And so the earliest support we have for the Hebrew psalm reading is the Masoretic Text, 10th century, but then we have Origen and Jerome. So now let's get to that. So the middle 3rd century, we get Origen. And up here, so the reason why mid-2nd century is okay is because you have some of the translations in the Hexapla. Even though Origen wasn't mid-2nd century in terms of when he did it, the texts that he included were. So my earlier comment should be taken reference to the Hexapla texts. But then we have the actual preparation of the Hexapla by Origen in the middle of the 3rd century. And so you had this 6-column Old Testament, including these 6 versions. A text of the Hebrew Old Testament, which Origen believed accurate. Okay, so now we have a Hebrew text based on what Origen represents in the middle 3rd century. Then also in the Hexapla, you had a transliteration of the same Hebrew text right here into Greek. And so this would be a one way of helping establish an accurate text, of course, because then you could double check it. And then it also had a Greek Septuagint translation current during the day, one of the quote-unquote official copies of the Septuagint text. You might consider that somewhat like, for example, Codex Vaticanus Alexandrinus or Sinaiticus, potentially a version like that used during Origen's day. And then you had a text from a Jew named Aquila who lived around the early middle 2nd century. You had also, as part of the Hexapla, a Jew or Jewish Christian who lived around the 3rd century, Symmachus, did a version of the Hebrew text or translation of it into Greek, Hebrew Aramaic text. And then you also had another version by Theodotion, a Greek convert to Judaism, who around the 2nd century revised an earlier Greek translation, and it became associated with him, especially in terms of the text of Daniel. You'll see that represented, for example, in the edition of Rolf's separately. Okay, so let's go over this information a little bit more. So as noted on page 1, the summary we did, let me get a drink of water. Each hexaplaric witness, except for Origen's copy of the Septuagint, appears to have read it appears to have read ears. And so the Hexapla, for the most part, is support for the reading ears. And we could date the support overall from the early to middle 2nd century, depending on when one of the translations was done in the Hexapla, and then, of course, through to Origen's preparation of the Hexapla in the middle 3rd century. So by the time, so you would have at least that understanding current to some extent. That is the use of the term ears in either Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. From the early to mid 2nd century into the mid 3rd century, and then, of course, also into the 4th century. as well as later on. We have the 6th century text that's transcribed in the 9th and 10th century, Codex Sangermanensis. Okay, then we have the 4th century revision of an earlier Psalter by Jerome. So there's definitely the reading ears that you can see as part of the textual tradition of Psalm 40, verse 6. Now, Hebrews 10:5 only in the tradition, it's just body. It's solid New Testament text reading, P46, I believe being our earliest witness to Hebrews 10:5. Okay, so we don't really have an early Targum of the Psalms that we could use to establish any basis for, the reading more so than, say, Jerome or others from the 4th century previously. So probably we could assign the earliest existence of text supporting the reading ears to the early 2nd century. Probably based on Theodosian's text or another Septuagint text or Greek text that read that way, or possibly even a Hebrew text that was consistent with that reading, since that's what they were translating, right? Hebrew or Aramaic text. So, although we don't really have, as I said, evidence of a Psalms, an Aramaic version of the Psalms. So, in either case, the Masoretic tradition and the reading Aznaim, ears, does have support, at least all the way, I would say, in the Greek and Hebrew traditions, using Jerome and these other witnesses, the Jewish translators, to the early 2nd century. Now let's compare that with the reading body, soma, or otia in Greek. Okay, so we have P46, which I've referenced several times. It's an excellent 2nd to 3rd century New Testament witness to the letter of Hebrews, and other texts. But the reading in Hebrews 10:5 and P46 is soma. Okay, so early 2nd, possibly 3rd century. So now we're pretty much right where we basically could accept the earliest reading based on Jewish translations of the Septuagint text, possibly the Hebrew text, existing in the early 2nd century. So we're pretty much right on the same period of time where we have the readings, ears, and body, early 2nd century. Okay, and then we get to the middle 2nd century. We have the one reading in Origen's Hexapla, the version of the Septuagint likely existing in his day. But this Hexapla overall supporting the reading, ears. Then we have 2nd to early 4th century P. Bodmer 24 or Rolf's 2110, a Greek text that is consistent with body. And then come our 3 great codices readings, the 3 primarily referenced codices, our earliest, completest Greek texts. They're not all complete, but they're the completest, earliest codices that we have in uncial script. And they're dated, in the case of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, to the 4th century. So it'd be the same time as Jerome, and representative of a text potentially used and known by Jerome, as well as even representative of an earlier time, of course, because they're copies of earlier texts. So as well, Origen living in the mid-3rd century, writing in the mid-3rd century. And then you have the Codex Alexandrinus of the 5th century. And by 5th century, of course, we mean the 400s. So that's a significant body of evidence. The New Testament reference, which, again, now remember, we're granting the early 2nd century reading to the text of the Jewish translators that are cited in the Hexapla, right, in the middle 3rd century. But we're granting it to an earlier time based on the fact that they would have been done, if they're consistent with the reading shown in the Hexapla, done in the early to mid 2nd century and thereafter. So we're willing to, even though we don't have, for example, a text of Theodosian datable to the early 2nd century that shows otia, it's consistent with what we see in the Hexapla. And so knowing when Theodosian likely did his translation, if it's the same, we're okay with dating that to the early 2nd century. In the same vein, P46, though dated to the 2nd to 3rd centuries, represents a first century reading, right? Because there's no reason, there's nothing in the tradition of the text of Hebrews, letter to the Hebrews, that shows an inconsistency with that reading. You won't even find it referenced in, for example, Metzger's textual commentary. There's nothing, because there's no issue with it. So we know, based on the available evidence, which is good, P46, we're talking potentially within 150 years of this being written. Maybe 100. There's a little bit of give or take in terms of the dating of these manuscripts, but still well within the realm of accuracy when it comes to what we're looking for, and that is relationship to the first century. So P46 gives us our earliest reading, in my opinion, apart from actual translations and texts of the Psalms. Maybe we could then, for that I would say probably Bodmer 24 to the second, depending on when you date that. And then, of course, we could also cite the Septuagint reading in Origen's Hexapla, but you have the other readings there. And so the cleanest and earliest reference that I believe we have of the text of Psalm 46/3967 is Hebrews 10:5. The first century citation of that text in a letter to Hebrews, where there are numerous references and quotations of the Psalms in ways that are designed to help them understand and appreciate their view of Jesus. And so it seems to me very unlikely that the writer of Hebrews would have just knowingly used a questionable text that diverged so differently either in terms of the reading, otia versus soma, or understanding. That is, having your ears cleaned out or prepared in the sense that your body is then ready to do the work that is described. It seems to me that reading and the way it's presented and the context of the quotations from the Psalms has every reason to recommend it as our earliest and best text of what the Psalms, Psalm 40 verse 6, 39:6-7 read in the first century. It's possible there were other readings, or that both readings existed because of the two understandings that we just described in terms of preparing your ears or cleaning them out, and that really being the same as preparing your body to do the work described. So it's possible we had both readings or understandings that were essentially consistent with the meaning of the text in the first century. And so I'm not ruling out that ears was represented in either the Hebrew or Greek traditions of the first century or earlier. But we know, based on the quotation in Hebrews 10:5, that there was a text, more than likely, I believe it's more than likely that the way that the writer of Hebrews quotes the Psalms and uses the Psalms, that he's quoting from an edition of the Psalms and not making direct translations. It's possible, but I think more than likely he's quoting from a known reading of the Psalms. That represents our earliest support for the text of Psalm 40:39 in this respect. Okay, so let's see. We can add a few other things. We'll skip past that. So in the Greek editions, you'll find different things. And I guess I will go ahead and read this part because it can get a little confusing, especially if you're doing any text critical analysis using Rolf's editions or the Gottingen editions, and you're looking at the notes and you're looking at the main reading, you're like, what's going on here? Well, let's go over it. All right. So in view of what we just read, even though there was a pretty good balance of text material, right? We have mostly hexaplaric support for ears. We have Jerome in his translation of the Psalms using ears. Translation of the Greek Psalms, I believe, is what that Psalter is. And so it was into Latin from the Greek text. And so I think that shows. And he probably would have also wanted to be consistent with what he thought was the Hebrew text. So I believe Jerome represents solid support for ears because of him being a Christian and knowing the texts and also understanding the texts and using ears. So either way, we'll cite him. I include him on the side of the reading ears, the Masoretic tradition. So you have support there. I don't think it measures up to be as significant as what we have here, although this is mainly Christian tradition stuff, especially the three great codices and P46. But I think we can still explain it in the context of the early Christian thought and ministerial work and activity and citation of these texts, and see that there was a text they were using that had that reading, and that was consistent over a period of up to Codex Alexandrinus, right? 500-600 years at least. All right. And so let's take a look at, just to go over the text critical editions, Rolf's and Gottingen. In view of the proceedings, let's read this part together. It's somewhat strange to find ears, right? So even though you see here, you have Hebrews 10:5, the quotation of what would have been a Greek translation existing at that time, more likely in the first century. You have one part of the Hexapla, you have the Bodmer Papyri, and you have the three best codices. All of that, all Greek text stuff. And yet in the Gottingen, one of our best text critical editions today, the main text uses otia, ears, not soma. All of these use soma, body. Just like on the thumbnail, the word I squared in red. The Gottingen uses otia. So why would it do that with all of this? It's because there's a couple reasons. We've already talked about them, but let's go over it. All right. So the Greek text ears is in the main readings of Rolf's 1931 and 1979 Gottingen editions of the Septuagint at 39.7. And then in Rolf's Gottingen editions, in the reading at Psalm 39.7, he lists as support for ears the 4th century, Latin translation of the Psalms by Jerome, which is significant, I believe. But then the later 6th century transcription of Psalm 39.7 in the 9th and 10th century Codex Sangramanensis. Okay, and then Rolf cites, in addition to that, he cites the 4th century Latin translation by Jerome and the 6th century and 9th, 10th century texts. And then he cites the reading ears in Origen's Hexapla and the Hebrew Masoretic Text. Basically, he cites all of this and none of this, which in a Septuagint edition is very rare, right? Because these are your main Septuagint codices and some papyri and other representation of the Septuagint text. Now, okay, there's a little bit of there is a change that's made at one point. So he cites them. Now, the Gottingen edition's note to this text ends with a reference to the reading body in Hebrews 10:5. So Rolf's, who did these editions, he does reference Hebrews 10:5, which is represented in P46, 2nd, 3rd century, good text. But he gives no references to Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, or Alexandrinus. The Bodmer Papyri 24 or Rolf's 2110, it wasn't available when Rolf's was doing his edition, so won't count that. Okay, so, but then in his Stuttgart editions down here, I reference, in his note it changes. He references the 4th century Latin Psalter in support of the reading ears, but then in his note he does cite the alternate reading body. And now he cites, in addition to Hebrews 10:5, the reading there, he also now cites Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus. So it just shows you how much evidence, weight, Rolf's gave to Jerome's Latin Psalter of the 4th century and to the Masoretic reading over and against the readings of the three codices, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus, as well as Hebrews 10:5. So, let's take a look here at a quotation that I give in this article. And I'm going to put this back online today. I'm going to show you the change I'm going to make and the reason I took it off before. This was written back in 2012. Well, let me just share with you this quote that explains some of the aspects of the quotations of Psalms in the letter of Hebrews. This is from Martin Carrer, the Epistle to the Hebrews in the Septuagint, in Septuagint Research, Issues, and Challenges. Further references below. Here it says, there's good evidence that our author appreciates his written texts where he has them. Above all, the quotations from his favorite books, Psalms, the Pentateuch, and Jeremiah, are not only frequent, but also very excessive. And then he states here, so the conclusion is almost certain that the author possessed and used scrolls of the Psalms and Jeremiah. And I agree with that, just in reading those texts and the way that they're cited. I mean, it's either he's just setting himself up to be refuted and openly exposed, which doesn't match the quality and content of the letter to the Hebrews overall. Or he was just really quoting them as they stood in the text available at that time. Like this author agrees with here. So, and as you can see here, I wrote this back in June 17, 2012. But this was a mistake I made right here that was pointed out to me shortly after, and so I took it down. I said, in light of the best available evidence, the reading ears in the text of Psalm 39:40 in the late circa late 2nd century of Origen's Hexapla, 4th century text. I cite the codices of the Septuagint, 4th and 5th century. And in Hebrews 10:5, and I state that reading ears, based on this, should be preferred over the Masoretic Text reading. But, and I'm going to correct this and put it up today, and I'll put a note down here that I made that correction, just in case any of you downloaded the prior edition before I took it off, because I don't want anyone having inaccurate information. This should say the reading body. Again, this was in 2012, right? I'm not going to get into my personal circumstances while doing these things, but just know I was going through quite a bit during this time, and I just made a mistake. So I took it down, though, when someone told me about it. I just couldn't get back to it. So I'm going to change this to the reading body in the text of Psalm 39:40, based on the Septuagint of Origen's Hexapla, the text of Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus, as well as the citation in Hebrews 10:5. I believe that reading body should be preferred over the Masoretic text where it reads ears. However, as we have done this whole show, right, I've basically argued the readings are not that far off, manuscript support-wise. I do believe the reading in the Greek tradition comes out better supported textually. And it's also explainable in terms of potentially why certain Jews might prefer ears over body after, for example, the author of Hebrews cites that text the way he does using soma, and then also says that Jesus offered that body once and for all time. However, it could equally be argued by Jews who don't believe in Jesus that Christians changed the reading ears to body to more expressly represent what they believe to be the sacrifice Jesus offered, right? Because they likely wouldn't say he offered his ears in sacrifice. But nevertheless, it goes on to say in that psalm that a sacrifice and offering you did not want, but you prepared my ears. For what? To do all this type of work that was done in the body. And after hearing, having your ears prepared. And so the sacrificial part, as far as the body that was given, really doesn't have to depend on the reading of Psalm 40:39 in terms of body or ears. Right? Because we get that tradition already that was prefigured in Isaac and Abraham. We don't need Psalm 40 in order to tell us that a body was prepared if the reading is that the ears were prepared so that the body could then go do the things that the very next text say the one whose ears are prepared would do. And the very things that we read about Jesus doing in response to what he was hearing while with the Father, that he then went and taught. It's over and over stated that way. It's one of the most explicit teachings in the New Testament documents. So I believe that either way, if you're dealing with somebody who has a reading that says ears, at least now you know that there is support for that reading according to some early Jewish translations of the 2nd and following centuries, as cited in Origen's Hexapla of the mid-3rd century, as well as Jerome's Latin translation of an existing Greek text of the Psalms in the 4th century, that he probably also saw as consistent with the Hebrew reading, or not. It seems like he would have potentially done something different, but it's possible he just translated the Greek collection of Psalms that he had at that time and even saw them as superior. Because as I've written about otherwise, and as have others, the Septuagint was for a long time considered more authoritative, the most authoritative Old Testament document, at least the versions of it that were accepted as credible and authoritative in representing the earlier texts of either Hebrew or Aramaic. So it's important that we understand the context of thought and specifically of each author before we make too many, obviously definitive determinations or look into their motivations as to why they did or didn't do this. Obviously, Jerome was aware of a reading in the Greek Psalms that was consistent with ears, which is consistent with the Hebrew Masoretic Text of the 10th century, and also a 6th century and 9th, 10th century text of the Psalms in Greek, and earlier versions of the Psalms in Greek by various Jewish translators like Symmachus, Theodotion, and Aquila, according to Origen's Hexapla. And then we have all of our good text evidence in the great 3 most complete and earliest codices, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Vaticanus. And we have the reference in Hebrews 10:5, the quotation of an existing Psalms in the 1st century that provides us our earliest reading according to P46, but that shows what the text was originally, just like we granted for Symmachus, Theodotion, and Aquila, based on the Hexapla, right? Unless we have reason, we can accept them as representative as earlier. But where we get into things like the divine name, nomina sacra, obviously, we know there are existing texts or earlier texts that differ from later texts that we have to work through on that issue. That's not the case with this issue in terms of ears or body. We can not only accept both because they both find application, right? We've talked about the ears, read the text with Jesus. Well, we also know that in the biblical texts that we have the presentation of Jesus as one who has to suffer and die, similar to what we read about in our other Messianic texts that we believe apply to Jesus, but that were written before his time, like Psalm 22, Psalm 110, Zechariah 12, Isaiah 53, and all the other texts that we have reviewed to this point, Micah 5, and I still have many more to go. We have so much evidence that we can use to show that our belief in Jesus is based on really, really good evidence. The best. All these texts. And that even where we have like a difference in an early reading over a significant issue, like the Messiah and what would be done to him, right? Would his body be prepared? Or would his ears just be cleaned out? Well, if his ears are cleaned out, what does it say would happen next? Oh, he would do things in his body. So they're very similar. They're really not much different at all. And in fact, the entire quotation is made in Hebrews, whom many believe to be the Apostle Paul and his knowledge of these Jewish texts, but it's not necessary. So let's go back to that real quick. Hebrews 10, quoted right here. It doesn't just quote Psalm 46 or 39, 6, 7, right? The part with the body, soma. Goes on to say that he came to do your will. Right after hearing, that's what he would fulfill. And he goes on to say, the text says, I am come to do your will. And then he goes on to explain all of these different things that would take place and how they are fulfilled in Jesus. So with these texts and with our understanding and the things that we've considered, I think it's acceptable for us to use Psalm 46 or Psalm 39, 6, 7 in the Greek texts as pre-Christian evidence to show what people were believing about the Messiah, and that is, in our view, fulfilled. Either way, ears or body, and both, in fact, that's why it's either way, in Jesus of Nazareth, in unique ways. that show utter and entire dependence upon his God and Father so that he could come and do his will and help others to do the same by first hearing and then doing. And that's effectively what we see foretold about the Messiah in these respects to this extent. And we believe that the text as represented either in the Masoretic tradition or in the earliest Christian tradition according to P46, Hebrews 10:5, or in the Christian codices of Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, or Sinaiticus, and other early Greek texts, are consistent with our view about Jesus as having fulfilled this in either his ears or body, but really both, because it seems to me, and as we've shown, that that's the application that's made. Even with ears, you hear and then you go. If it's you prepared a body, you still go, right? That doesn't change the fact. If your body is prepared, if the reading is soma, just like Hebrews 10:5 shows, and our other text witnesses, well, how does that not involve hearing? Right? You have to hear, or you're not going to be able to do these things. What did Jesus say? I hear and I do, and I teach. It's not mine. It's from the one I was with, and he was telling me these things, and I opened my ears, I heard it, and now I'm here, and I'm telling you about it. That's it. That's exactly what he did. So if the reading is soma, or body, then there's no way that couldn't involve his ears, or having, in addition, as part of his body, his ears prepared in order to hear what he was supposed to teach and do. It didn't come from him. So the ears would be like the main thing in terms of receiving the message, which you then deliver. And so that's why I believe it's possible the writer of Hebrews actually translated the text into Greek and used soma, though the text may have read aznaim, ears, because the close association between ears and body is such that you couldn't have one without the other in terms of what it says is involved. Declaring the message, doing God's will. So I'm not so sure they're that different at all, even though they are different. You see what I mean? They're both referring to the same thing, and that is the preparation of the person in order to do Jah's will. And when it came to his son and the things that were prefigured, that included all of this: the declaration of salvation, teaching Jah's will, shepherding people in the name of Yahuwah, like Micah 5 says, serving as an angel of great counsel, a mighty God, just like the other sons of God could be called gods. And Jesus showed, according to John 10, when those who confronted him about being a mighty God falsely accused him of wrongly doing so, and he showed the right way that could happen. All of it is messianic. It's all tied to these texts. It's all correct in our view, because Jesus came not to do his own will, but the will of the one who sent him forth, Yahuwah. So I just don't see a problem there with the reading either way, and I'm more than happy to use both of them to help people appreciate that either way, according to the Jewish or Christian tradition, we have a text that is believed to have existed. We don't have the manuscript support like we do for other texts, like Isaiah 53, that are agreed to predate the existence of Christianity. But we do have a tradition and an acceptance across religions, Jewish and Christian, that believe that the book of Psalms, 40 or 39, Hebrew or Greek, existed before the first century, and either had the reading body or ears, which we believe, we can show, was uniquely fulfilled in Jesus.